Sullivan. I'm a member of the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly and our Labour Caucus, as well as community and labour activist, the president of CUPE 4308. And thank you, brother. We represent just over 400 workers at 4 different workplaces, community and healthcare workers. And I think it's ironic in some ways that while we may be unionized, most of our workers are still would be considered precarious workers. And I think that's part of the reason for the timeliness of a forum such as this, organizing in an era of precarious work, because that's more and more the reality for the majority of workers, particularly racialized workers, women and migrant and immigrant workers, as we enter into new stages of capitalism. And so we got together as the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly along with Migrant, No One is Illegal, and Justicia, organizations that all work around issues of status, migrant, precarious work, and felt that having a forum and a place for us to come together as activists, allies, community members, and supporters to start talking about this issue is important. And it also is leading into something bigger in January. We don't have flyers here with us, but we do have a sign-up sheet so you can get the information if you would like. The Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly is planning a conference in January, building a working class movement. And what we want to do as part of that conference is bring together different groups of workers, whether we're unionized, non-unionized, or organized, unemployed, underemployed, just barely making it by, folks in social movements, basically, you know, kind of revolutionary, radical left folks to get together and start talking about what we need from a working class movement, what we don't find sometimes in our own labor movement as far as the representation or the realities of the things that we do. And so this forum tonight is a way of us doing some of the groundwork for that conference itself, because we're going to be having some workshops at that conference around migrant precarious work, but also talking about some strategies and actions that we want to take as allies together to make the difference that we need in our working lives. So we're really excited to have everyone here tonight to take part in this, and I'm going to turn it over to Marco, who's with Migrant, to talk a bit about how the evening will be structured and to introduce our speakers.
Thanks. Good evening. My name is Marco. I'm with Migrant. I'm also staff of CUPE Local 1281. This forum basically is not to repeat whatever we have in the past. But like Kelly was saying, this is a build-up towards part of the build-up towards a conference in January. For us here today, we want to focus on the discussion on precarious work. Evelyn Encalada from Justicia for Migrant Workers, and also a member of CUPE 3903.
We're also part of the labor movement, but the grassroots labor movement. And in the back of the room, I have about 3 pages where I talk about how Justicia was formed. And basically, many of us, well, the core organizers of Justicia were basically expelled from the labor movement, the formal labor movement. So we had to either acquiesce and also negate that we have a voice. We had to decide whether we were just going to stay within that system, where we would just be getting orders from the top, and all that we had to do is just become functionaries of a hierarchical system that wasn't working neither for us, our communities, people who look like us, who talk like us. And so we decided we had to come up with our own space, and that's Justicia. And I come to you and I speak to you here in that spirit that we do not speak for labor workers, and that's one of the main breaks with the formal labor movement. We can't say that we speak for the 20,000 and now the 200,000 temporary foreign workers that are here in Canada, saying that we are the spokespeople for 200,000 people denies that they have their own voices, and that as a heterogeneous group, they have a plurality of voices and perspectives. And our praxis over the years has been meeting workers where they are at and walking together. And that's precisely what we did this Thanksgiving. I don't know if any of you saw, because of course the media doesn't pay too much attention to historic events of that sort, but there was a historic march in Leamington, Ontario. And for those of you who's been to Leamington? Yeah, hey, ooh, it's very important. But yeah, Leamington is the tomato capital of Canada. I had no idea that we even had a tomato capital at all, anywhere in the world. But apparently, yeah, there is a thriving capital of tomatoes in Leamington, but it's really a capital of greenhouse industries. And so, you know, I have a big problem with Good Things Grow in Ontario campaigns and images. You know, sometimes when I see images on the subway, I just want to tear them down completely, but then I have to be all Canadian and calm myself down, because otherwise it would be very un-Canadian. I'm just using that term because I heard it way too much this whole summer with the G20 and G8. When people were saying, oh, this is very un-Canadian. Well, the side of Canada that we see every weekend is very un-Canadian. And many of us lived also in the flesh, you know, with our immigrant working class families as well. And that we, you know, in the spaces that we try to democratize and, you know, force ourselves into, that we still, you know, experience and feel. And there was a march, yeah, that took 10 hours. That, you know, Sazna and Chris were, oh my God, like they were in Leamington every single weekend. And that's the thing, that the people that we work with are very important to, you know, agriculture. They don't feel that they're invisible at all in the farms in which they work, but they will tell you time and time again that they feel completely invisible before Canadian society. So what workers decided, and they were inspired by the G8, the G20 mobilizing in Ontario, they decided that they wanted to organize a demonstration similar to that, but that was going to take 10 hours long, where they would walk in the communities that also refuses to see them, the communities where they spend more of, you know, of their working lives in, rather than their own home countries. And it was migrant farm workers that decided to engage in this type of action. It's been a dream of ours since we started this work in 2001. When can we have a march? When can we, you know, like completely close down Leamington? But there's all these structural issues of workers, you know, coming together and defying, you know, the system this way. And that's the whole reason why we were formed in 2001. We were actually called upon to document what had happened in this wildcat strike that workers had organized in a huge greenhouse. And 21 workers were actually punished for their action, and they were repatriated. And I don't like saying the word repatriated because it sounds just too nice. They were deported, they were punished. And so we went to find out what had happened. And so there's all of these, you know, there's all this fear, but at the same time, there's workers who are just so fed up, and they were ready and willing to go. And that's what Canada is doing. You know, not just Canada and the global, but also the global economy as a whole. The workers who decided to march were primarily Thai and Filipino migrant women that were being brought in under the low-skill NOC C&D program, and this program is much worse than the seasonal cultural workers program. That's one of Canada's flagship programs in agriculture, and, you know, the foreign worker program umbrella as a whole. That we still, like, every day we have to, you know, change our analysis of that program because things change all the time. And so it's very confusing and very difficult to stay on top of the legislation that just doesn't make any sense, so contradictory. But I envision it in a sort of like a pyramid, where, you know, there's the most precarious workers are at the bottom in the NOC C&D, and all the workers that are there are considered to have very low skill. But of course, this idea of low skill versus high skill is highly racialized, and, you know, many of the farm workers that are ending up in, you know, in the greenhouses, and not enough, and of course, those commercials that we see on TV about who produces our local produce. Our teachers are, you know, like graduates of what's the university called in Mexico? That's the biggest university there. UNAM, yeah, UNAM, and of course they're also displaced farm workers and farmers themselves. And, you know, and when I think about organizing in a time of precarious work, it's organizing in a time of precarious living in a precarious world. One of the communities that we work in Mexico, in Veracruz, was completely flooded this year, and there was dozens and dozens and dozens of families that are dependent on Canadian wages for survival. They lost everything. So even when, when workers think that they've gotten ahead, that they could survive in a decent manner, then the world turns upside down on them, like the climate now. And because many of the workers live in very sensitive ecological zones, so there's so much against, going against the workers and their families. They're starting from a position of precarity within their own countries, and then when they come here, they get the huge shock of their lives, thinking that Canada is such a benevolent country, much better than the United States. But what happens to them here is they become completely stateless. Their own consulate officials act like coyotes. They act like traffickers. So in Justicia, we also work with that idea too, that of course, states are involved in trafficking in their own way, but legal trafficking where everything's okay if you give somebody a work permit, but a work permit that obviously just commodifies people, that doesn't allow people to be human, that denies people, the right to be with their families. I remember once having a conversation with a friend of mine who was working in Leamington, and he said, oh, there's a new compañero in the greenhouse, and he's not adjusting very well. He wakes up in the middle of the night and screams and screams and screams. And, so their whole lives are compressed between, work and work and work. Even the notion of time, it's so crazy how we know very well that capital can transgress time and space. Well, with migrant workers, with the most precarious, marginalized communities in the world, they actually lose time. They lose time with their families, they lose the cycle of life, and a lot of workers, that are here for 8 months, many of them tell me, well, Canada's not, Canada's just work. It doesn't count as life. But I'm like, but you're spending more time here. So, so it's very shocking, to talk to people in the way that they have to adapt to global processes and what that does also to their families. And one of the things that I'm really big about is when the growers here in Ontario, for instance, do not want to give the right to workers to unionize because it's going to destroy the Canadian family farm. But if you want to talk about family farms and families behind the, farm work, let's talk about transnational families, the families left behind that are all organizing, for their loved ones to come and work here in Canada. In the farms, and also, they're also part of the Canadian, agriculture, the families left behind as well. And what's so ironic as well is that, all these, there's all this dumping of corn, and corn prices have gone down, and farmers in Mexico have to compete with the U.S. and in Canada, but then competing means joining them. And working undocumented and working in precarious status at any moment, workers can be deported, within these temporary foreign worker programs. Like I operate a 1-800 number. I had to get one so that way workers didn't need to use calling cards. But sometimes it becomes so unbearable. Like I get calls like at 11 at night, at 12, because nobody else is around. There are no social workers running around in farms, checking in to see how employers are treating workers, of course. And so sometimes I get calls, brokers telling me that they're getting deported the next day, but it's 12 o'clock, I'm in the 905, I can't, rush over. And if I did, then, we would have to find housing for workers. Workers would not be allowed to work anywhere else. So there's a slew of obstacles and problems that occur along the way. And for me, I really think that it's not that these programs don't work well. They work extremely well, but for whom? For Canadian capital, for profit, and to subsidize, our prices, to subsidize, and also like with the tomatoes, they're not that cheap, but but they do keep costs down because workers receive minimum wage and they don't get paid overtime either. And a lot of workers will tell you they do want to work as much as they can. Why? Because if they have Sundays off, then they have families. Then Canada becomes more unbearable. So for us as organizers, our role is to accentuate how workers are fighting back and not assuming that they're not fighting back if they're not joining unions. For instance, now like in Ontario, where farm workers cannot unionize, but that doesn't mean that farm workers are idle and they're not organizing in their own terms. And for instance, we've been working with Dignidad Obrera Agrícola Migrante, which is a group comprised of migrant workers in the Niagara region. They made history as well in the region this year with a public education module that they implemented and that they want, more support in. And also they organized a whole entire event, to commemorate the bicentenary celebrations of Mexican independence and the independence of other Latin American countries. And they did everything from scratch to finish, and also defined that idea that, some, other people in the community have said that they can't do anything because they're migrant workers. Well, yes, they can. Si se puede, and they did it. I don't like to use that term anymore because Obama completely ruined it, but it just came out, sorry. And also, to end with that, so one of the main struggles for me is staying in the struggle. And sometimes staying in the struggle means a precarity for us ourselves and being true to our principles. But I'd rather be in a position where I could dream than being in a position where I have to just kill my spirit. So I don't know.
Xoliswie Ndlovu, a vice president of CUPE 3908, who's also a PSW worker, personal support worker, a precarious worker, to share her stories with us.
I'm with local 308 and I'm the vice president. Thinking back, before I came to Canada, I would speak to a bigger crowd than this without being nervous. Why? Because I had a job that I could depend on, that I knew that I'm employed Monday to Friday from 9 to 5. I'll go tomorrow, that job is still there. I was confident, my self-esteem was high. I had no problems. I had to perform and work well and keep my job. But then because of globalization, I ended up here in Canada. Because as you are sitting here, you should know that globalization doesn't only happen, what we're seeing here in Canada, it happens everywhere. When they go to other places in the world, they will cut their jobs. They will turn the full-time job into a part-time job. And they will make it so uncertain for you. The future is just gloomy. And then you think, maybe if I come to Canada, I won't find it. Maybe things are better here. But it's the same, or it's worse. It's worse for me because I left a full-time job. That really works on your self-esteem. That's why I'm nervous to speak to even a smaller crowd today. My self-esteem has been eroded by these precarious jobs that I do as a personal support worker. To me, my experience is that precarious worker is like a terminal illness. There's this anxiety whether you're going to make it tomorrow. And the anxiety is that, am I going to be employed tomorrow? Am I going to be able to pay my bills tomorrow? Am I going to be able to buy food for my family tomorrow? What if I go and I'm told this job is gone? You're on call 24/7. That's not life. It's very sad. You can't budget. You can't even think of investing in a house for your children. I tend to see it every day. I hear Sarah parents talking about our generations to come. But as a precarious worker, you don't even think of the next generation. You can't even look after your own child. You can't even plan for their education. Because again, you don't even see how they are doing because you've got 2, 3, 4 jobs. You can't even help with their homeworks. That's precarious work. Because you have to make ends meet. You have to pay your bills. You have to buy food. You have to have shelter over your head. That's the reality of a precarious worker like myself here in Canada as a personal support worker. Long hours, low wages, 24/7, no life, no social life. That's reality. This is very, very sad because of capitalism, classism. I'll say even sexism because mostly people are affected, women, single mothers, and there's no one to help. And if we look today, every day we read about children having stabbed each other. They're 15, 16 years, or even 12. And if we took statistics, we find that these are children of single parents. And those parents are not at home. They're at work 12 hours, 13 hours before they come home, or the children have been taken by your children a society because there's nobody to look after them? What if it's a good job, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday? You have a life, you have a family, everybody can depend on you. You can plan your life, you can buy a house, you can buy a car, you can have all that luxury that we need as human beings. Who is there to decide that because you're an immigrant, you are rationalized, you mustn't have a normal life? This is unfair. It's very sad. That's why I say it's like a terminal illness. That you don't know whether I'm going to be with my son tomorrow or I'll be gone. Am I going to be able to provide for his education in future? Or is just going to end up as a street child as well? Because by the end of the day, you are doing this job where there are no benefits. By the time you're 16, you can't even stand up on your feet because of the job that you've been doing for years. And then what do? It's going to look at you, oh, mom, you're tired, you can't go to work. Your back is aching, let me go to work. I'll drop out of school, or I'll take this year off just to help you. And you see, it's a cycle. That poverty will never end. It started on us as parents. It's going to go to our children, to their children, because they'll never have a decent education. If they had to have that decent education, then it means I have to work and break my back every day with no benefits. It's very sad that even big companies in Canada, in Toronto here, they're doing this precarious work. They're employing immigrants for their own profits. Because they don't want to pay good wages, they don't want to pay benefits. They don't even want you to have a social life. Because it's so embarrassing to tell you that I've got 3 jobs. Because before, you won't even ask me, can you come to a party tomorrow? Because you know, I have no social life. I'm tired every day. And sometimes to try and get that self-esteem is to go to school. How many degrees are we going to have as immigrant workers here in Canada? Because by the time you're in school, you're trying to concentrate on something, focus on something that maybe you enjoy doing. You finish that program, whatever you're doing, that degree, you won't even get a job, a full-time job. There's this anxiety. So when Kelly asked me to come and speak to you, I'm really telling you about my experiences. And this is not life. It's an experience for every immigrant person. When we came to Canada, actually the first thing that I was against was Multiculturalism Act, whereby they're going to place you in those ethnic groups and you think, oh, she's from Zimbabwe, so I've got friends. You know what I've seen, what it does, that one? It keeps us in that group so that you say, okay, you're working at the dollar store, at least you're better than me. You know what, I'm a personal support worker, you know. So this is our life. We think, you know, the only way you can get there is to get a job at the dollar store. Why don't I meet with people at Downsview, the Canadians? Why don't we meet and mix? Because then you have created a system where you're going to provide for those people, and then for the immigrants, you're going to provide that kind of life, you know? And then we think it's okay. It's not normal, it's not okay. It's very sad. Nobody's a slave, but there's still slavery in this precarious work. It's slavery at its best. Because they're paying me $5 for 20 hours, and then it's better than slavery. It is slavery. It is slavery, only there's a little bit of pay. But that pay comes with a lot of work put into it. That pay comes with a lot of sweat, pain, and sorrow even to our children. Because right now, as I'm talking here, my son is alone at home. I hardly see him. I'm working 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Sometimes I even work on Christmas Day, just to have that double time and a half. But Christmas is supposed to be time for families. They're even advertising right now, it's Christmas time, you know? Jingle bells, everybody's happy. I'm not happy. Because I have to work on that day just to make a little bit of money. To pay the bills, not even to buy my son a good toy, but just to pay the bills before I even think of buying food. Because the most important thing that we have room over our heads. But then if we had those jobs that we came here and we promised we were going to get as skilled workers, where I'm working 9 to 5 and I've got benefits, we'll all be happy. We'll all be happy. But the system has been presented in such a way that when I came here, I think within a month or so, I had a worker's permit. Not even a student permit, you know? And I think that is very wrong. They need to give you whether it's a student permit so that you go to their colleges, to the schools, and then get the Canadian experience first. Why are you given a worker's permit so that you're going to work in the industry? And you're going to do that job for 10 years before you even think of going to school and get that Canadian experience, you know? So that's the way of just isolating immigrants, putting them there, you know? But you are the engineers of this economy. Why don't you give us full-time jobs where we can have good self-esteem, where we can have benefits, where we can depend on our employers that, okay, I've got a job. When I'm sick, I don't lose time. I can go on vacation. I can provide for my family. I can be a normal person. Because when you don't have a job that is certain, you can't be normal. You can't be normal. Life needs normal so that you can plan. Today I want to do this. But with the kind of job that I do, I can't plan. I can't plan. I have to listen to the phone whether I've got an assignment tomorrow morning. If it's not there, it's not there, and it means there's no pay. In a day of 8 hours of work, I can only get 1 hour that I'm paid for very low wages because that's the only assignment that is there. And tomorrow that job won't be there. And for 7 years I've been doing this in Canada. And it's not changing. So it's very sad. These are my experiences as a precarious worker. And in conclusion, like I really liken this to a terminal illness. But I'll say also precarious work can be cured. There's a cure for that. It means we have to mobilize. It means we have to talk. It means we have to do everything. We have to work together as labor movement and end this precarious work in Canada here. They can't depend on us. We have to depend on them to provide because they need workers. They need these jobs to go on. They need to build the economy. They are using us to build that economy. So they have to look after us. They have to give us benefits so that when we retire, and we can also plan for our children and their children and their children. But we can't plan like this, so we need to work together. We need to move forward in this labor movement. Thank you.
Jojo Geronimo, Executive Director of the Labor Education Center and also an organizer for Community Alliance for Social Justice, which is a Filipino organization.
Thank you. I feel like we should just pick up the various stories and themes we have heard so far from the three speakers. And I feel I don't have anything to add anymore, actually. I'd love just to sit down in a corner, actually. But I guess I have a task to do. So I put together some random notes. However, I do want to pick up some of the threads that were already presented earlier, if I may. As was mentioned, I work with the Labor Education Center here in Toronto. We work with unions, and we also work with migrant workers groups. Gabriela, Migrant, Caregivers Action Center, and Justicia. And we learn a lot. We people at LEC, Nicole and I are here, learn a lot from the various experiences, the struggles, and the analysis that migrant workers bring to their struggle. So I would like to explore that and reflect on those learning points that we have gained so far in terms from our collaboration with these groups. But to say briefly, from my personal location, 20 years ago, I was a political refugee from the Marcos dictatorship. After spending some time in his prison, came to Canada through the States. But of course, I could not remain in the States because the States was supporting Marcos those days. Well, they still do. Not Marcos, but the current government. For 2 years, I was roaming around the U.S. from east to west with the name not my own. And finally came to Canada, but my 3 kids remain in the States, where they grew up, and they're still there. They're U.S. citizens. Came to Canada, worked with immigrant communities, and finally with the unions. And as I said, I'm now at LEC. So I'd like to pick up some of the themes mentioned earlier. Hassan said that we have a migrant workers movement, a global migrant workers movement. We also have what we call a labor movement. We call a labor movement. Not too sure how much of a movement it is. These two so-called movements are supposed to be part of a bigger, broad-based social justice movement, shouldn't they be? They should. But we are still searching for that unifying framework to actually say that they are working together. What I experience, and I think some of you will attest to this through our conversations, is the various disconnect between the two movements, when there should be natural connections. And this is not to blame one or the other, just reflecting on this. I find myself, when I am in a meeting with my sisters and brothers in the labor movement, there's a different vibes in the conversation than when I am in a conversation with migrant workers. In the latter, there is a sense of urgency, a life and death kind of a conversation. Just a few days ago, somebody has to fly to India, almost in secrecy, because her personal security is in danger. There's a lot of burdens and problems and challenges that the labor movement also is struggling with, but somehow the bridging hasn't happened. So we at the Labor Education Center are trying to find that kind of a bridge that will be based on certain principles. And one of the principles mentioned earlier, and that I was asked to make sure that I go back to, is the principle of autonomy, the principle of self-organizing, the principle of self-empowerment by migrant workers, for migrant workers, and with migrant workers. If we can get the unions to recognize this, it will be a starting point. There cannot be solidarity. There cannot be unity between the two movements unless there is recognition from one to the other that yes, you have the right to exist as a movement without being in competition with my movement. There can be many movements though. I think this is where we're at the moment in the conversation. There are happy times when the two are working side by side with each other. And there are happy times when, like in this room, there are sisters and brothers who are active in the labor movement, but are also active in the migrant workers movement. But as institutions, I think, our labor movement has to begin to acknowledge formally and respectfully that the migrant workers are also a global movement by themselves. So, going back to my notes, if I may, I'm not sure if this is still relevant, but in any case, I think the struggle around precarious work perhaps must be placed in this particular political context. The context where we see two trends. One is the global trend, the global migration, very often forced migration of workers. That has been deliberately created by capital in order to create a permanent pool of cheap, disposable, and exploitable labor. That's deliberate. If migrant workers were a country, they would probably be the 5th or 6th largest country, some 250 million migrant workers moving around the world. If you could put them all in one place, it would be the 6th largest country on the planet. That's one trend. There is another trend that is national. The Canadian government has turned the immigration department into a recruitment agency. Our immigration department is not an immigration department. It is importing temporary workers. Explicitly. And after they have given their labor and their sweat, they will be asked to please leave because you're only here on a temporary basis. Now, those two works together. The push factor of capital exploiting and creating, displacing workers, and the pull factors of Canada inviting very nicely the skilled, the educated, the experienced to come to Canada and to be exploited. I have in the basement of my house now a young couple with a little child who just arrived a month ago. They do not know what the next day will bring, but they are here. How will the labor movement address this question? Unfortunately, I don't think this is a priority conversation for us. It's a daily experience for the migrant workers. But let me be very selfish for the moment and say, us in the labor movement have a vested interest in addressing the immigration policy. Why? Because the more there are temporary workers who are exploitable, the more are the jobs of unionized workers going to be undermined. Logically, correct? There will be less security for union workers if there are more the temporary workers, because the employer would rather hire those workers on a contractual, temporary, contingent basis, and why do we need all these permanent unionized workers? If simply out of enlightened self-interest as a union member, I should be worried about that immigration policy that is creating this permanent pool of cheap labor, quote unquote. But there is a problem why labor, I think, does not want to talk this way. It's a very slippery conversation. It's a very slippery slope. If you are anti-immigration policy, there is a danger that sooner or later you will sound as if you are anti-immigrant. I am against the immigration policy that exploits temporary workers. But that does not mean I am anti-immigrant worker. That's a very delicate balance. Unless we have a real strategy to support the migrant workers movement, labor will be a little too narrowly selfish to protect its turf against the influx of temporary workers. I throw it out as a challenge, as a problematic to be solved, to be talked about in honest conversations. The difficulty we have is we cannot even begin the conversation because it is too threatening for some people. We at Labor Education Center are somewhat privileged, somewhat, and we can speak this way because we do not belong to any of the affiliates. We do not get any dues from the affiliates, but we work in the house of labor. We are loyal to the unions, I would like to say. But in loyalty, we must ask the difficult questions.